my name is Kaylee Wilkie and I am a sophomore here at Waldorf. I am a double major in both history and creative writing. The subject of my research this semester has been the Black Plague and particularly how it affected anti-Semitism, serfdom, and medicine/science. Since it's a very known topic, it wasn't terribly hard to find viable information, and the actual hard part was figuring out what to narrow it down to. A peasant in England during the 14th century would have a lot to fear: financial rot, famine, and during the 40s and 50s, the Black Death. The Black Death was a horrid pandemic that killed up to half of Europe and had a 70% fatality rate in most victims' cases. So even if a victim were to avoid being sick or recovering from the plague, most people, or most of their friends and families, would have suffered a cruel fate. However, the world after the pandemic was anew in many good and horrible sides, with new ways to treat illnesses, the disruption of serfdom, and the extremely high rate of anti-Semitism. This reflects a lot in today's society, which recently suffered the coronavirus, a pandemic that shaped how people live, work, and let themselves be treated. And while they are two somewhat alike in the circumstances, had the Black Plague never happened, COVID would have probably hit the world way harder than it did, killing way more than it already has. Even with COVID reshaping how people live and work and being the time period where activism against prejudices being at an all-time high, the Black Death literally shaped how we as humans look at the world. The Black Death had many names, all of which got the point across better than the last: the Black Death, the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, the blue sickness, and La Peste, the pestilence, and of course, the Great Mortality. All of these names to the sickness or death caused by the great killer of the 1300s. Though none of these names truly let on how influential this pandemic would become, one of the few changes in the world went through after the plague ended, which historians are still unsure how exactly it ended. Was it kickstarted anti-Semitism, made people reconsider hygiene and medicine, and destroyed the current economic system through most of the countries it affected? It was truly a pandemic that still shapes the world that is here today, even if it has been almost 700 years since. The Black Death killed anywhere from 75 to 200 million people in Europe, Asia, and Africa, spread by rats, fleas. The plague is single-handedly the most influential pandemic that has graced this fine earth. The plague has also caused countless social, economic, and scientific problems and solutions, such as an uproar in anti-Semitism, an uprooting in serfdom, and the plague required people who survived to look at how they were treating illness, whether it was by leeches or actual medicine. By far, though its disaster ran its course through Europe, it became and is still the most influential pandemic that the world has ever had. Before the Black Death, Jewish people lived in peace with their Christian neighbors for the most part, though of course there were some misunderstandings. However, in Europe, they lived in peace for the first time since the Roman Empire. Of course, then the Black Plague arrived via boats and sailors, which quickly spread from ports to other people inside of the cities, which, while it was spread via fluids of the body such as blood and saliva, many people believed that it was the Jewish community who wanted to destroy Christianity and poison their water supply. Jewish people were imprisoned, tortured, and killed because of false accusations, and while Christians were sure that they found the culprit, no one seemed to get better. And of course, lack of medical knowledge did not help this fact. London, at this point, was a cesspool of disgusting. Human feces floated down the streets into the water supply. People lived and slept side by side with their animals. The only true fix for any medical issue, from a cold to scrofula, which was much like tuberculosis, was to put leeches on it or have an exorcism. This, plus the fact that the population's immune systems were weakened because they couldn't cure the common cold, did not help the survival rate. Of course, in this time, it wasn't as if there was no one to try and cure the sickness. Doctors tried to help the sick, and others who sold the equivalent of snake oil also preyed on the less educated. People who were sick called plague doctors, one of the things an average person would imagine when referencing this period of time. These doctors dressed in long robes with hoods and leather beak masks, which they stuffed with herbs, citing that the fetid air was what was causing people to get sick. Of course, it was the transmissions of fluids and sick from one person to another, so these people were right in the wrong way. Nevertheless, the lack of medical knowledge and science knowledge largely attributed to the high death rate. Slowly through the plague, people got better at cleaning and disinfecting, and people grew to be able to survive the Black Plague, and it helped advance the medicinal practices to get to the point where we are now, with vaccines. And finally, the Black Plague disrupted serfdom. Serfdom was the practice of having people who were legally bound to land in the will of their landlord. That land was traded between what was called feudal masters. While it sounds a bit like slavery, the main difference was, of course, the fact that slavery sold living human beings and serfdom sold land, to which people are bound. The Black Plague killed a lot of these feudal masters and serfs, leaving the masters who lived without serfs and the serfs who lived free. It increased the mobility of labor and allowed people to be choosy with where they lived and how they were treated by landlords. It also, interestingly enough, increased the quality of food that previous peasants expected, as there were not as high a demand for good quality food as before, since a large amount of those who could afford it died. The Black Plague led to advances in medicinal knowledge that kicked its way to developing vaccines, caused an uproar in anti-Semitism and hate crimes against the Jewish community, which carried over to many centuries afterwards, and in a disruption to serfdom, which laid the groundwork for laborers' rights, which advanced as a slow march but is still in a much better place than a century ago.